welcome. We're in Singapore having a conversation about remote working. We're at a Ius Laboris get-together, very interesting discussion of employment law issues. One of them is remote working. I'm Scott Worthy. I've got my colleague Peter Kiely with me here today. We wanted to have a quick chat about remote working issues. So, Peter, what is the employer's responsibility in terms of remote working?
Well, COVID and lockdowns really have focused, and for the first time people have had to consider what it might mean, whether it's a good idea, what the obligations are. And I think there are two concepts, and they're quite definitional. One is remote working, which we've moved on to from COVID, and I think we're now in a phase of flexible working, whereby employees have decided they quite like the idea of working from home for a day or so a week, and employers are mostly happy for that to occur, providing it's practical. If you work in the tourism industry or a dairy farm or in manufacturing, it's just not going to be practical. And that makes me think of what the key point and obligation is, that if you are working either from home or in the workplace, there is an obligation on the employer to keep the employee safe and take all reasonably practical steps to keep the employee safe.
So that's a risk of potentially flexible working. What does the employer need to do to manage those risks?
Well, I think the first thing that I always advise people is you really need to be on the same page as the employee. You need to document what the mutual obligations are. But the employer has to be proactive to ensure that the employee's workspace at home or conditions of employment, whether it's furniture, whether it's the computer, whether it's the workstation, is safe. That might involve a consultant visiting, or it might involve a checklist for the person. What an employer can't do is just leave it all to the employee to set up and ensure their own personal safety and well-being.
So we're thinking about personal safety. You've mentioned the physical setup of the office or environment at home and making sure that people are working in an appropriate space. But there's also the mental health issues that come along, and we've seen lots of comment about that recently with remote working or employees being isolated at home. How does an employer deal with that?
I think we're at the genesis of that. I think that that's going to be a real issue. And one of the key issues is the boundaries between rest time and home time and working time. And if you've mixed them all up, that's where you're going to get mental stress and isolation. If you're at work, morning tea, lunchtime, afternoon tea, start time, finish time, are defined by practice or because your colleagues are there, you know it. If you're working, for example, on the kitchen table at home, the chances of you overworking, the chances of you not taking care of yourself, the chances of you continuing to check emails and working late into the night, I think, continue. Couple that with a bit of social isolation, and you have got the ingredients, I think, for increased mental health problems. So the employer needs to check in. I think the employer needs to set very clear boundaries as to when communications should be sent from work. I've seen some companies and employers now say you're not to work beyond, say, 8 p.m. or whatever, and don't be sending emails to your colleagues or clients after that, for example.
And in terms of other legal challenges, we've talked about the mental health and well-being. What are some of the other legal challenges that an employer has for employees remote working?
Well, as I said, as a matter of definition, if we're talking working from home, I've covered that. But if we're talking remote working, where someone, for example, wants to work in another city or particularly in another country, another jurisdiction, there are some really serious legal issues to consider. The first might be the taxation one. Once you start working remotely, say, for example, in another country, after a period of time, and it depends on the country, you run the risk of there being a permanent presence. Secondly, some countries are very strict about their ability for non-residents to work. So there might be a visa issue. Another issue I've come across lately is data protection and privacy, whereby the person is using their personal computer, they're on a Wi-Fi scheme wherever else, and the client's or the customer's private information is not necessarily protected to the same degree and rigour, and your privacy and data protection obligations continue. What if the person was to have an accident overseas? What's the insurance cover, for example? Those kind of benefits. So it's actually legally a little bit more complicated than it seems, so you do need to take advice.
Yeah, so an employee comes to you and wants to work remotely. It's not just a matter of saying, yes, go ahead.
No, particularly if they want to work out of the jurisdiction. Obviously, we're in New Zealand, but I've been involved where people want to work in the Pacific Islands, for example. And as I've said, tax issues, immigration jurisdictional issues, health cover issues, because New Zealand and accident compensation or the company's private insurances say, well, no, we cover you in New Zealand. We never agreed that you would be covered elsewhere.
Well, thanks, Peter. That's a fascinating insight into remote working and working from anywhere and the challenges of doing that. Of course, if you want more information, you can always look at the Ius Laboris website for more details about this issue.
Thanks very much, Scott. That's been a great coffee.
Yeah, thanks, Peter.
Cheers.